30% off the retail price.
U.S. Representative Connie Morella also addressed the Jewish Council for Public Affairs yesterday. The Maryland Republican discussed the role of the Congress in the Middle East peace process, and her comments are a little more than an hour.
Great, thank you. All right, I would like to welcome you to the plenum session. Let me start off by introducing our organization one more time. Hundreds of Jewish leaders from across the United States and Canada are gathering here in Washington, D.C. for the 2002 Jewish Council for Public Affairs, or JCPA, annual plenum. JCPA's plenum is the largest yearly meeting of the national public affairs arm of the organized Jewish community of the United States and Canada. JCPA, the public affairs arm of the organized Jewish community, serves as the national coordinating and advisory body for the 13 national and 123 local agencies comprising the field of Jewish community relations. Our plenum session today is provided to you to give you an overview of the important issues and priorities of Congress in this second session of the 107th Congress. And this second session will take you right up to election time, hopefully giving the candidates a month or so beforehand to get out there and campaign. But this election coming up is a pivotal one, with the balance of power in play in both the House and the Senate. And often a session leading up to an election has legislative issues that will have a bearing on that election. We are very honored to have with us Congresswoman Connie Morella of the 8th District of Maryland. Let me just touch on some of the items in her prepared bio and then give you a personal introduction. Congresswoman Morella has been to Israel at least 3 times that I know of, is a great friend of Israel and a great friend of the Jewish community. She is also very active in a wide variety of other issues. She is the former co-chair of the Congressional Caucus for Women's Issues, and is nationally recognized for her work on behalf of children's issues, domestic violence, women's health, and on educational and economic equity issues. For her efforts on behalf of children, youth, and families, the National Council of Jewish Women presented the Congresswoman with the Hannah Greenbaum Solomon Award. Maryland has included the Congresswoman in its Women's Hall of Fame. Glamour magazine has honored her as Woman of the Year for fighting women's fights. What did I say?
No, that's good.
Glamour fights for fighting women's fights and winning. And in 1997, the New York Times recognized her as one of a dozen who have risen to prominence in women's health. Also, I guess I'd never introduced myself. I'm Lee Cowan. I'm Vice President of the Jewish Community Council of Greater Washington, and also chair its Government Relations Commission. And so I've had the opportunity, thank you, opportunity to work with the Congresswoman quite a lot and quite closely. And what I was leading up to is to tell you that our own council has awarded her our most prestigious award, which is the Breslau Goldman Award. And let me just quote from the award, the plaque that we gave her, for her outstanding leadership in community relations and her dedication to social justice. That's the prepared introduction for her, but I have known Congresswoman Morella, Connie, for over 10 years. I consider her a good friend. As I mentioned, she's a good friend of the community. You know, the Federation has its annual Super Sunday every year to raise money for the community. In Washington, we've held Super Sundays for 23 years. She has been there for 22 of them. I think she missed maybe the first one. We don't... We don't even need to tell her about it. She just shows up. There's no heavy lifting there. And on a very personal note, I think one of the best testaments to the person, Connie Morella, is she has 3 children of her own, and unfortunately, when her sister passed away many years ago, leaving 6 children, Connie and her husband Tony took those 6 children in, and she and her husband have raised 9 children. So, without further ado, let me introduce Congresswoman Connie Morella.
Lee, that was incredible. Incredible. I want to take Lee Cowan with me every place I go and let him introduce me. Frankly, his introduction is probably as long, maybe longer than the comments I have for you. But the reason he's such a very, very good friend, and the reason that I was kind of chuckling when he said Glamour magazine, I want you to know it wasn't because of glamour. And that's why he completed the statement when he said it was for fighting women's battles and winning. So it had nothing to do with the glamour as we perceive it as such. But I'd like to start off with quoting 2 women that you know from the past with regard to the introduction. And one is Mae West, where she once said, attributed to her, and you may have heard about it from a history book or the old flicks, she once said, "Too much of a good thing can be downright enjoyable." And I enjoyed every word of his introduction. I appreciate it very much. Lee, thank you very much. Second woman I'd like to quote has to do with the length of my comments. It's what Elizabeth Taylor said to her 8th husband, "I won't keep you long." And I won't. But you've had a great program from what I understand, and I know today is the culminating day. And as I look around, it's always very exciting and strengthening to see so many of the friends that I've known through the years and continue to work with. Ron Halber, who is here, Mark Levin, who is here. Of course, you're going to hear also from Mark Palavin, with whom I've worked. And I also want to congratulate Michael Bowman on taking on the awesome and very exciting responsibility of being the new president of JCPA. And of course, I have to mention Dr. Leonard Cole, who has been chair. And where is he? Okay. I'd certainly like to thank him for the work that he has done to make this such an incredible group, and I am very honored to be here. And of course, Hannah Rosenthal, the executive director. You have a very prestigious group of people who are so committed and so dedicated. Well, I know that this year's theme is home and abroad. So I guess I can begin to date some of my comments, as everyone traditionally does now, with 9/11. And when 9/11 occurred, it tore away our kind of solidarity, and it brought us a great deal of grief, a great deal of anger, a great deal of anxiety, but at the same time gave us an enormous amount of resolve that we would work together with other nations that are so inclined to eradicate terrorism in the world. And I must say, I find people have been cooperating enormously, transcending the tremendous grief that they have had, and again, as I mentioned, the anxiety. Well, also security has been heightened. And here you are in the nation's capital, one of the first times that student groups are now able to visit the White House. I began to see some student groups on the steps of the Supreme Court and on the Capitol grounds. We encourage that. But we have had our monuments, we have had our federal establishments with very high security. To give you an example of what has happened to me as a member of Congress, I traditionally park in a garage named for Mr. Rayburn, the Rayburn Garage. And going into the Rayburn Garage recently, just as an example, Capitol Police officer is on one side. On the other side is a District of Columbia National Guardsman, wearing, incidentally, a camouflage uniform, how do you call it? Why do you call it camouflage? Because you can spot them right away. I mean, just think about it. And several other assistants to the guards who put the mirrors under the car, check the trunk. Very often, if there is a dignitary visiting, we'll also have the dog to give the extra scent to the trunk. And the officer said to me, "Well, Mrs. Morella, how are you?" And I said, "Well, I'm just fine, thank you." And he said, "I'm glad to hear it. You know, you represent my mother, and she loves you. May I see your ID?" One continuous sentence. There was no pause or a comma or anything in that. And that's exactly what is happening. But people realize that, and so maybe they're changing their routes whenever they can, but they're also very patient. And I was just at a conference on education, and going through the airports, it was in Phoenix, going through the airports took an enormous amount of time. But you just have to kind of recognize that attitude is altitude, and just relax and know that we're doing it for a good reason. But I say that to you as a preface because this is what Israel has been going through for such a long, long time. And then to read in the paper about people who are having pizza where you have a terrible tragedy, or bar mitzvahs that have occurred. So many things that have occurred. The shipment that was apprehended by Israel that was coming from Iran, that kind of terror that Israel has been laboring under for so many years, has said to us in the United States, we always thought we understood, but now we understand more. And we rise and we stand in solidarity with Israel. We did that actually by a resolution in Congress in December. And many people on the floor of the House spoke, certainly I did too, but it was a very strong vote of solidarity with Israel, and we do realize that. One of our concerns, of course, obviously, is Chairman Arafat. Is he relevant anymore? That's a real question that we have. It has been said often that he never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity, and we have some grave concerns about the commitments that had been made and the fact that he needs to stop the constant violence against civilians. That means fulfilling promises of prosecutions. He has got to maintain the rule of law. That would be what would demonstrate Palestinian interest in engaging in discussions of peace. And without serious action to eliminate, to even harness terrorism, Arafat can't expect any opportunity for negotiations. And as a result, we've come to expect very little of him. So we stand in solidarity with Israel and in the effort to eliminate the terrorist attacks against our citizens. We continue to be unified with other nations, too, on this issue, and that unification must not cease to be heard around the world. I want to mention it was in November, and you probably know all of this, when we had six groups that were put on the terrorist list. We had the Hamas, Hezbollah, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Palestinian Liberation Front, Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP, the General Command. But I believe that in the meantime, we also must insist that the administration add Al-Aqsa, the Brigade, Tanzim, and Force 17, that they should be added to the list of foreign terrorist organizations. If we're going to maintain our commitment to holding those who associate with or support terrorist acts responsible for their associations, then we need to make sure that, or do all that we can to have those organizations added on the FTO list. And you know that ILSA was reauthorized for 5 years. I think it was in August of last year. You also know that you have very strong support in Congress, and the financial aid has continued. I submit it will continue. We must continue and expand our ongoing cooperative efforts to fight terror. The partnership must be supported by the $2.8 billion that the United States has committed toward economic and military aid. We have such shared values of democracy and freedom to keep our countries united, and our alliance against terror only strengthens this relationship. I am one of the supporters, sponsors of the Middle East Commitments Act. I think this is a very important piece of legislation. I hope that it gets a hearing, and I hope it comes out on the floor, where I think it will pass, to ensure greater compliance by the Palestinian Authority for their empty promises of peace. This Middle East Peace Commitments Act should be considered and should be voted on and should pass. What the bill does is it would finally hold the Palestinian Authority accountable for its deliberate refusal to crack down on terrorist groups like Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. As Arafat continues to ignore his responsibility, these terrorist organizations continue to take innocent lives. The continued refusal of the Palestinian leadership to live up to their commitments to resolve their conflict with the State of Israel by exclusively peaceful means requires a decisive U.S. response. And I hope that if you are talking to members of Congress, that you will mention that particular bill as it continues to grow in strength. Another issue I'd like to just point out to you, I have worked when I was first elected to Congress. I started in 1987, and I became the freshman co-chair with John Lewis of the Congressional Caucus on Soviet Jewry. Well, a lot has happened since then, and as a matter of fact, I've been to Israel 4 times, right? And one of them had to do with the being able to visit some of the refuseniks that we had helped to get out of the then Soviet Union, who were then involved and very active in Israel. But I know that religious freedom throughout the world is a priority, and I also serve on the Human Rights Caucus of Congress now, and I share your beliefs. And you may have heard of a letter that I signed with Tom Lantos, a gentleman from California. We are circulating this letter throughout Congress, and it has to do with just the Jackson Vanik issue. The letter deals with so-called graduating Russia from the scope of the Jackson Vanik Amendment in order to garner support for religious freedom among our colleagues, which is why we are circulating this particular letter. I have copies that I will be able to distribute to you if any of you would be interested in the letter, and I do hope that you will get other members of Congress too, your own members, to sign on to that letter. Russia has made dramatic improvements on immigration and the protection of religious and ethnic minorities, but also there have been verbal and written commitments that the administration and the Russian government have made during the past year on clarifying our shared commitment to religious freedom. Our commitment to defend these rights underscores the importance of U.S.-Russia relations. So I do think the Russian Federation deserves recognition as a critical ally in the war on international terrorism, in which the civilized world is currently engaged. But at the same time, in the context of productive and constructive relations between the United States and Russia, religious freedom and the protection of minority rights must remain a priority on the bilateral agenda among the presidents and governments of both, or between the presidents and the governments of both countries. So this letter that Congressman Lantos and I are circulating to collect support from members of Congress, we hope that it will indicate the importance of making sure that religious liberties are preserved in our relationship with Russia, and to assure that in graduating individual countries, the continued dedication of the United States to these fundamental rights can be assured. One final point as we look at the President's budget, and you're going to be hearing from 2 excellent speakers. You're going to hear from Mark Palavin, and you're going to hear from Diana Aviv, and I think they just told me that they're going to be discussing some of the domestic issues. I'd like to mention a little bit of just a touch on domestic issues. I know that you are all concerned about low-income families and individuals who need aid to make sure that they do get the adequate kind of aid that we as a country should be offering them. Congress is now going to be considering reauthorization of the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, the TANF program that you know about. It is an important component of how states and local areas assist their most needy individuals, the elderly, recent immigrants, refugees, and those with low incomes. And those people benefit also greatly from something that is critically important, and that is the Social Service Block Grant. In the fiscal year 1999, the largest expenditure for services under the Social Service Block Grant, the expenditures were for child daycare, foster care for children, and prevention and intervention services. Funding for that block grant has been reduced considerably from its peak in fiscal year 1995, when it then received $2.8 billion. Now, this fiscal year 2002 appropriation, which we have been living under now, included only $1.7 billion for that block grant. So there has been a reduction, and I hope that you will join strongly in supporting the restoration of the Social Services Block Grant to $2.8 billion for fiscal year 2003. Your timing is excellent if you do any of your personal lobbying on it, because this is the time when the budget is being crafted and put together and where constituent concerns are being reviewed and considered. Adult and child daycare, employment training, foster care, nutritional assistance, so many more critical programs that make a difference in people's lives are dependent on the increase of the Social Services Block Grant. So I hope that you will support that. So it's been a great pleasure to be here with you. I must also mention my good friend Harry Bodansky, who is here also. Yeah, I looked over and I saw Harry. He realized that a friend indeed is a friend indeed. But as we talk about block grants and the future, one of my favorite expressions is, so when you touch a rock, you touch the past, and when you touch a flower, you touch the present. But when you touch a child, you touch the future. That's what you are doing in each and every way with your commitment and hard work, and I'm very honored to have been with you today. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Lou. Thank you. 1985.
Congresswoman, thank you very much. We enjoyed your comments. I may have been wrong about the number of times that she went to Israel. There's 3 that I knew of, but it was 4. But I did want to mention that in 1985, a couple years before she was elected to Congress, she went on her first trip to Israel, which was sponsored by the local Jewish Community Council of Greater Washington. Yeah. So. We're now going to have 2 other panelists to sort of talk about some more of the issues and, as the Congresswoman mentioned, about domestic issues of concern to our community. Our next panelist is Mark Palavin. He is the Associate Director of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, the RAC. Everybody knows about that. A position he has held since May of 1996. He is one of the Jewish community's leading legislative strategists, and having worked in Washington for over 15 years, one of its senior lobbyists. According to the recent book, Jewish Power, the Religious Action Center has become, quote, has become one of the most powerful Jewish bodies in Washington, second only to AIPAC, end quote. I don't know if that's kosher to mention that here at the JCPA plenum, but that's what it is. And we're all in this together, so I don't have a problem saying that. The center not only advocates on a broad range of social justice issues, but provides extensive legislative and programmatic materials used by synagogues, federations, and Jewish community relation councils nationwide, and coordinates social action education programs that train over 2,000 Jewish adults, youth, rabbinical, and lay leaders each year. Mark was recently elected vice chair of the JCPA, and he is the first staff member of a member organization to serve as an officer of JCPA. Finally, it mentions here that Mark is a graduate of Brandeis University with a BA in politics, which is exactly the same credentials that I have. So with that, let me introduce Mark.
Well, thank you, Lee, for that invitation and for that introduction. I can't believe it was quite so comprehensive and yet left out the many awards I've received from Glamour magazine. What I hope to do in the next 7 or 8 minutes is both talk a little bit about the political context in which we find ourselves and then touch kind of smorgasbord style on 3 or 4 issues that are hot on the congressional agenda right now and that I hope will be hot on our communal agenda as well. So at the risk of offending some of the perhaps tender sensitivities in this room, I want to talk for a minute or two about politics. The political landscape, of course, always shapes the legislative calendar and the legislative agenda. But this year, that's more true than at any time in my memory. The House and Senate are famously and narrowly divided. The Senate almost literally split down the middle. And the 2002 elections, which are, alas, right around the corner in political calendar time, will exert a powerful influence on each and every action in the second session of the 107th Congress. It's widely thought that control of both the House and the Senate is up for grabs this November. And as Congresswoman Morella can testify, there are scores of highly competitive races all around the country. This leads, it seems to me, to 2 distinct, sometimes complementary, sometimes contradictory political dynamics. On the one hand, the leadership of each party will seek to draw clear distinctions between themselves and the other party. Try to make clear to voters what it is they're choosing between. On the other hand, individual members of Congress are likely to look for middle ground, trying to avoid potential and politically polarizing votes. That's one reason why I'm so pleased that we here at JCPA have the chance this morning to hear from Representative Morella. She and her colleagues in the informal and ill-defined, but influential and indispensable moderate Republican caucus clearly hold the balance of power in this congressional session. I would venture prediction that there will be very few close votes in the House in which Representative Morella and others like Congressman Chris Shays, who JCPA heard from in October, in which those people are not on the winning side of the vote. One final contextual observation. The upcoming election has already begun to assert an almost gravitational type of force on members up for re-election. And one result will be tremendous pressure for early adjournment of this congressional session. Between the President's Day recess, which is underway right now, and a spring recess and a 4th of July recess and an August recess, this Congress simply will not have many legislative days in which to get its work done. So you heard from Congressman Morell and you'll hear from Diane in a minute. It's not that there's any shortage of work. The challenge is trying to get it done in a way that's going to allow members of Congress to go home and to campaign. What does that agenda look like? I'll mention 4 issues relatively quickly, and then I hope we'll have a chance after Diana talks a little more about budget issues to talk about what's on your minds. First, Congresswoman Morella talked about the Middle East. Congress plays an absolutely indispensable role in helping provide American leadership in the region. The challenge here is at once holding Chairman Arafat accountable and holding out a vision of the future, a peaceful vision of the future. That, of course, is no small challenge. But I think it's clear the American government has to help articulate that vision, has to help paint that vision, and if they don't, it's not clear to me who's going to. So all of our members of Congress have an indispensable role, both personally and in speaking to the administration and in calling for vigorous American leadership and support of a peace process. Second, energy issues, environmental issues. One of the first issues that'll be on the Senate floor when Congress comes back later this week is the Senate Energy Bill, a far-reaching and comprehensive bill. In August, the House passed its own energy bill, a deeply troubling bill, one which would have opened the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge for drilling, provided over $33 billion in tax breaks for oil and gas companies, and failed to provide any increase in the corporate average fuel economy standards. There's probably no single step we can take that would make as great a difference in addressing the challenge of global climate change than raising corporate average fuel economy, CAFE standards. CAFE standards set the fuel economy, the number of miles per gallon, for a corporate fleet of vehicles. For example, all the vehicles Ford produces in a particular category, such as passenger cars or light trucks, must meet an average number of miles per gallon. The higher we raise CAFE standards, the less gas we use, ameliorating climate change, saving money, reducing our dependence on foreign oil. Currently, the standard for passenger cars is 27.5 miles per gallon, a number that hasn't been increased since 1975. Yet this number is still 7 miles per gallon higher than the standard for light trucks, a separate category that includes sport utility vehicles, even though they're now overwhelmingly used for transporting people, not goods, and used much more like passenger cars than trucks. The Senate bill does not currently contain language on CAFE standards. There's every expectation the final bill will indeed have strong language. As you go back home and you talk especially to your senators and to your members of the House as well, because this bill will come back to them, I hope that you'll include a discussion of CAFE standards in your conversations with them. Third, let's give you a nature of how much I'm skipping around. Third, Congress will have the opportunity this session to address the staggering global AIDS pandemic. The magnitude of the global AIDS crisis is all but incomprehensible. Today, there are over 36 million people living around the world with AIDS. And 10 new people are infected each minute of every day with the deadly virus. More than 18 million people have died of AIDS, more than 15 million of them in sub-Saharan Africa alone. And World Health authorities predict that that number may well double over the coming decade. The United Nations, to its credit, is finally giving the global AIDS credit the attention that it demands. The President's budget proposal, however, allocates a grossly insufficient $200 million as the American contribution to this vital global effort. Congress will have a chance to increase that funding level. I believe that urging them to do so must be one of our highest priorities. Finally, a few words about what we used to call the Faith-Based Initiative, and we call now the CARE Act, Charity Aid Recovery and Empowerment Act of 2002. Some of you may remember at the White House, it's about 2 weeks ago now, the President hosted Senator Lieberman, a Democrat from Connecticut, Senator Santorum, a Republican from Pennsylvania, and they unveiled a compromise version of the President's faith-based initiative. And my friends, it is indeed a compromise version. It's one that is light years advanced over the very troubling, very flawed bill, H.R. 7, that the House of Representatives passed. This bill simply drops the charitable choice provisions, some of the most troubling part of H.R. 7. And at the same time, there are a lot of positive provisions in this bill that simply weren't in H.R. 7. The CARE Act includes tax incentives for charitable giving, including a tax deduction for non-itemizers, and allowing IRA rollovers for charitable contributions. It includes vital technical assistance for nonprofits seeking to provide social services. It funds the President's Capital Compassion Fund to the tune of $150 million, puts some money on the table, something that H.R. 7 failed to do, puts an additional over $200 million on the table for the Social Services Block Grant, the Congressman already spoke about, probably the single most important program in terms of providing social services around the country. So there's a lot of good stuff in the CARE bill. There's some problems with it as well. It's a big bill. We're still digesting it. Still trying to figure out the implications of some of the language in the bill. Still trying to digest exactly what it says about religious icons, for example, appearing in space, where these programs will be provided, and about governance of religious institutions. There are a fair number of unanswered questions about it. It is, however, light years advanced, as I said, over the House bill. And one of our challenges, one of our main messages, I hope, leaving here, we're saying to our senators, and especially to the members of the House and to the administration, this bill is not H.R. 7, and the great danger for us is that Congress will move forward and try to find a compromise between these two bills. Senate might pass this bill and go to conference with H.R. 7. If that's the case, we really have very little to talk about. There's not much that's salvageable in H.R. 7. And we saw some of this political dynamic already. The President's original proposal included some funding for the Capital Compassion Fund and included some funding for technical assistance to the tax provisions, and a lot of that was jettisoned in the House when the going got tough. And the challenge to the administration, supporters of the bill, is will that remain in the bill as the process moves forward? That, I think, has to be one of our other most important messages as we speak to our members of the House, speak to our members of the Senate over the coming weeks. Again, I'm delighted to be here with you this morning. I look forward to taking some questions and talking about the many other issues that I know are on your minds. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. Our next speaker is Diana Aviv. She has served as the director of the Washington Action Office of the United Jewish Communities since 1994. A few years ago was named the vice president for public policy for that organization. Diana's work in Washington focuses on federal legislation, public policy, and regulations concerning health and human service areas, which have an impact on the work of local Jewish federations. The Washington Action Office also explores opportunities to secure federal funding for the system's social service agencies. Diana was formerly an Associate Executive Vice Chair of JCPA. Welcome, Diana.
I'm really delighted to be here with you today, and one of the people who is not recognized on this panel that I do want to recognize is Reva Price, and I want to thank her for putting this program together and for working so closely with us on all of the issues that matter to our joint communities. She really is a treasure and a great asset to the community. I also want to thank Congresswoman Morella for making our task today much easier. It's great to sit up here and smile and nod with everything and think, well, how does one navigate something that one doesn't really want to agree with but not offend anybody? And we don't have that problem today. It really is a pleasure to be with you. And of course, to my friend Mark Palavin, I was so grateful what he said about the CARE bill until I realized that he said everything I was about to say about the CARE bill, to which he responded, "'Tis better it comes from me than from you." I want to talk a little bit about the impact of 9/11 on us and on the Congress, and also what we're facing, what the challenges are. 9/11 impacted us in profound ways. Earlier I saw Ron Soloway in the room somewhere, one of the people with whom I work most closely, representing the New York Federation, and you just have to talk to them to hear chapter and verse of how our social service agencies in New York City rose to the challenge and continue to provide all kinds of supports and services that is so customary and typical of our community in responding to crisis. It impacted us in lots of other ways as well. And one of the issues, Congresswoman Morella, that I wanted to mention to you is that there isn't a Jewish agency in the United States, not an organization, that hasn't spent considerable time and resources thinking about how they're going to manage their security needs. When we see reports from documents that have been left behind in Afghanistan, targeting Jewish organizations and Jewish officials, we know what we've always known, and that is that we can at any time be the subjects of attack. And there are many people in our community who've turned to me, and certainly I'm sure to Mark and to others, and said that as the Congress deliberates and thinks about how they are going to address the security needs of the United States, we who provide services to the public and need to make sure that the people who are served through our institutions are protected also need to maybe get some kind of help from the public sector in making sure that the security needs of our people, the general public and our own community, are well secured as well. So that as the President has set aside a substantial amount of money in his budget, and as the Congress deliberates on how to spend that money and what those priorities are, we will certainly be at those tables and sharing with you what some of the profound impacts are for our local community in the security area. Let me also talk to you a little bit about where we are in the budget process. And the reason that I think it's important is, just like in anybody's personal budget, their family budget or the city's budget, the budget reflects the priorities of a community. It's a living document in which people deliberate and decide what are the most important ways to spend money, what are the issues that are most important to them. And for us as a community, therefore, looking at the federal budget becomes an extremely important act of making sure that the country's priorities are similar to those that we share, and if not, that we try and move and persuade members of Congress to think about and to respond to some of the issues that we think are important. When the President put forward his budget a couple of weeks ago, while it's a non-binding document, it allows us to take a look and see what are his priorities and how, if it were entirely up to him, which it's not, how he would spend our tax dollars. And in his $2.1 trillion budget, I thought I should just share with you a couple of numbers that are important. One is that for discretionary money, both defense and non-defense discretionary money, there is $773 billion. If you add all the entitlement programs together, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and all of the other mandatory programs, it's $1,159 billion. So in fact, the lion's share of the money is allocated, and Congress doesn't have as much to say about that unless they change the rules of who can participate in those programs, and the big debates come around the discretionary, both the defense and the non-defense, as well as what to do about the interest on the debt, which is $181 billion. That's what makes up this budget. Discretionary non-defense, non-homeland security, the increases in the President's budget we analyzed amounts to 2%. And if you consider that increases, just adjusting for inflation, is at 3.5%, you understand why some of the congressional Democrats are claiming that the health and welfare programs that we care so much about will sustain a $15.8 billion cut if the President's budget were to be enacted as is in this coming year. We're not so happy about that, and we're going to be working very closely with you to make sure that those programs don't sustain cuts, particularly since we're at a time when we are seeing increased need in our social welfare agencies, in our senior programs, and in all of the kinds of programs that our local federations and Jewish community supports at the local level. This administration is also, as you know, for the first time in a number of years, projecting an $80 billion deficit for fiscal year 2003. And if you think this doesn't matter, let me suggest to you that from a psychological point of view, it has a profound impact. Because as we go and talk with members of Congress about increasing funding for certain programs, it's unlikely that they're going to have a place to take it from that isn't already spoken for by some priority either in the President's budget or already in the budget. And so we get into the battle of competing over compelling needs and making the case for why these needs are more important than others. And that's not an easy task to do. From our perspective, though, if you look at the President's budget, from the health and welfare perspective of looking at those social service programs, we see that most of those programs have been flat funded. Some of them have sustained cuts, although not as big as we would have thought, and there are some notable exceptions to that, where there are some increases in areas that we are very supportive of. For example, one of the President's new initiatives that we feel very positively about is what he has described as his USA Freedom Call. And into this program, he has suggested would like Congress to support $560 million to engage citizens in promoting homeland security and civic volunteering at home and abroad. And this would be achieved by expanding the Corporation for National Services AmeriCorps and Senior Corps, and also the International Peace Corps and a new Citizens Corps. As you know, we come from a community where, for us, the 2,000 hours of volunteering that he recommends over a lifetime is what probably all of you do in 2 years, never mind in a lifetime, so please don't listen to that part. Please know that for us, the volunteering is part of what we do and part of who we are. That is why you're here today. So we think that the President is on the right track with this, and we intend to work very closely with him and to strongly encourage members of Congress to support this kind of initiative. The reason also we're very pleased about it is this is the kind of left-right coalition that doesn't break out on party lines. There are Republicans and there are Democrats who can support this. There are some on both sides who think maybe this isn't the way to spend money. But in an election year where so much seems to be measured in terms of what's going to happen the first Tuesday in November, it's very encouraging to find a program that can be supported by our voluntary sector as well as by members on both sides of the aisle. So to you, Congresswoman Morella, we want to say to you that we hope that you will work with your colleagues to make sure that this becomes part of the budget for next year. The President, as I mentioned, has also included over $30 billion in homeland security and support on security issues. And we think within that context, we're going to be meeting with members of Congress to find help on security issues. We were very pleased that the President thought that the Emergency Food and Shelter Program was an important program that needed an increase. I say this to you because for us, for our social service agencies that run food banks and shelters and provide emergency assistance to people at need, we've seen substantial increases in the last 6 months. And so moving from $140 to $153 billion for us is a pretty good thing. We like the fact that the President is focused on getting a prescription drug benefit of some kind. We know from the moment of suggesting such an idea, which wasn't even on the radar screen a few years ago, to enactment, there will be a lot that can happen. And our job, I think, is to make sure that that prescription drug benefit that will help, in our case, our senior population and is of profound importance to frail, elderly people who are on fixed incomes, we want to make sure that benefit is as generous as possible. I tend to be one of those who believe that a journey of 1,000 miles begins with the first step. We may not have the most generous package in the first year, but let's start this and let's build on that. What we will be turning to members of Congress to get better funding levels for is the Section 202 housing for seniors. For those of you who've been to our senior housing programs across the United States, you know that there are long waiting lines. You know that the levels of funding aren't sufficient. And for us to see even a 1% cut, which not only includes no adjustment for inflation, but an actual cut in money, is a great disappointment for us. We thank you, Congresswoman Morella, for talking about the Social Services Block Grant. We are delighted it's in the CARE bill. We are disappointed the President didn't include it in his budget, but he is committed to this, and so we will be working very closely with you to get that increased. And for those of you who live in very hot and cold climates, I just came from Boston this morning, very cold. The LIHEAP, the Low Income Energy Assistance Program, to be cut by 18% doesn't make sense to us. We think that is one that ought to be funded at least at current levels. Similarly, for the Community Services Block Grant to be cut by 12%, we're not crazy about, and nor the Community Development Block Grant to be cut by 6%. So those are areas I'm giving notice to you that we're going to be calling you up, writing to you, and encouraging you to work very hard and assiduously on this. As you know, as the community advocates and the ones who know how to meet with your members of Congress when they're home and to make sure that they know what our priorities are, we can't do our work here in Washington without you. And so we will be looking to you to take this message and to move forward and to make sure that the people who are the most vulnerable, those who are at risk and in need, will benefit by the generosity of our public sector and of our federal government's budget. Now, let me just say a word or two about some of the other issues, and one of them is the care bill. Mark, I don't think I could stand up here and not say anything, even though you said it, but I'll try not to say the same things you said, except to say that we see this as very different than H.R. 7. We have worked very closely with the White House. We believe that they have come a long way in recognizing that the bitter debate that happened in the House of Representatives and ultimately the vote that was near on a party line vote, not entirely, was something that wasn't what this bill was supposed to be about. If the President is committed to helping the faith sector to do its work and to meet needs, at the very least, there needs to be additional funding to help us meet our needs. That the getting into an entanglement on church-state issues ends up dividing the country more than it does helping. And if there is a way not to do that, by providing additional funds, by giving incentives to people to give to charities, and helping those charities that are so small that they need additional help, then why not create the kind of bill that will do all of those kinds of things? And I think that the credit goes to both parties, Senator Santorum, as you know, Republican of Pennsylvania, Senator Lieberman, Democrat of Connecticut, as well as the President, to craft the kind of bill and then to invite around the table for conversation the civil liberties groups, the civil rights groups, the faith community, the fundamentalist groups who themselves had some problems with H.R. 7 on the other side, to talk about how we move forward and not have this fight on charitable choice at this time. And so we hope as you move forward that you educate your lawmakers about it in the recesses and also not in the recesses, and make sure that we move forward in a positive way. One word about TANF, just moving very quickly, and then I'll wrap up. We're okay. We're not. So I'll say these very quick. If you think I don't speak fast, listen to this now. Bert, listen quick. One quick word about TANF. There is going to be the reauthorization of the welfare bill, now known as TANF. Those who loved the enactment of TANF will point to the fact that 56% of the caseload has declined since 1997. Well, that's fine so long as the people who went off the caseload have jobs and have support systems and have childcare and healthcare and all the rest of it. We really need to take a look to see what's happened to those folks. And I'm sure Hannah Rosenthal, who's a tremendous expert in this area, will tell you that the story's not as generous as the statistics suggest. And so as we meet with lawmakers about that, we want to make sure that there's adequate funding to ensure that those people, both who are on TANF and those who are not any longer, have the kind of supports that they need. And finally, I couldn't leave this podium without saying to you that for our community, for the Jewish Federation system, one of the areas that we've been focused on most strenuously relates to seniors who are living in their communities, who we want to help continue to live as independently as possible. And in that regard, we will be turning to Congress to expand a program that we started this year and got funded, as you know, known as naturally occurring retirement communities, in which we bring services into those communities rather than pushing those people into supportive institutions. We think that this is a magnificent way of helping people to age in place, to remain independent, and it's a cost-effective way. Both from a left-right point of view, from a Republican-Democrat point of view, we think it makes a lot of sense. We have people interested in this on both sides of the aisle, and so we will be asking to do that. So I conclude by by saying to you that it is now up to those of us to seize the opportunity and to make sure that when Congress finishes its work this year, that the document that they produce in the form of the budget and the legislation that they pass is the kind of material, the kind of action, kind of legislation of which we can all feel proud. Thanks.
Thank you, Diana. We have about 5-10 minutes for Q&A, so please step to the mics. Since our time is so short, please keep it short and to the point, and if you want to direct it to one person or another, please do so. Go ahead.
I'm John Sealer from Tulsa, Oklahoma. I would like to address my question to the Congresswoman. Many of the representatives and senators that I've spoken to often comment on the serious problem it is of fundraising and the constant need to finance their next campaign. What do you think the prospects are for the proposals that are before Congress right now, and how will this really impact your life? Is this really going to give you more time or make a meaningful change that will help things out?
I think it's critically important that this Congress, among the priorities that were mentioned, will put on the President's desk campaign finance reform. I was one of the signers of the discharge petition. In fact, I was among the first signers of the discharge petition in this Congress, and did in the previous one too. Why? I feel that, as Diana mentioned, that even a small step can lead us to larger avenues, and this campaign finance reform package is going to get rid of soft money. We'll be looking at, issue ads in terms of indicating when they can be used, cannot be used. It is going to move us forward. There is an obscene amount of money that goes into campaigns. I often feel that people are judged by virtue of the green in their treasury rather than the gray in their craniums. And the media helps that too, because you look at a campaign, how much money have they raised? What has happened, and I'll be brief, what has happened is that the confidence in government is eroded every time they hear about the money pouring into campaigns and the time people spend in raising the money. And of course, Enron wasn't the reason that the bill passed in the House, because we had been working on that bill for years, but it really gave a little extra momentum to it. So I hope that the bill will get out of the Senate. It's all ready to go. I really believe it will get on the President's desk, and I believe the President will sign it. We do need campaign finance reform. It's not a panacea, but it really says to the nation, we believe that we should be pulling in the reins in terms of the incredible amount of money that goes into campaigns.
Marvin Schneller from Kansas City for Diana and Mark, if you have a comment. I'm curious if within the mainstream Jewish community and within the UJC system, if you see meaningful pressure to move to the right on the national Jewish agenda.
No, I don't see any meaningful pressure. Let me say this, that since the Jewish Federation system, as you know, includes everybody, because if they're not donating, then we'll get them anyway. We have people of all stripes, left, right, Republican, Democrat, and so on. What I have found is that when community leaders are aware of what the funding goes for, and when they understand that over 55% of the dollars that our social service agencies get come from the public sector, federal, state, and local public dollars, and that our philanthropy, our philanthropic efforts, and we raise a tremendous amount of money. It's over $2.5 billion a year, which is extremely generous on the part of our own community, only constitutes between 1% and 5% of those agencies' budgets. I think that the community leaders understand that as the federal government has a responsibility to meet needs, they work with the voluntary sector, and it's through the voluntary sector that those needs get met, and that it's not a Republican or a Democrat, a conservative or a liberal perspective. So in that regard, I haven't found it to be a problem. I think in our own community there's a much bigger debate on the issue of taxes. so that on the spending side there's less of a debate. But when it comes to whether our community should be involved in taking positions on raising taxes and what those positions would be, we would find that there's more of a fallout. So we tend to stay away from those issues.
If I can do that without spilling anything, let me just add a comment. I have read a number of stories in the press making the suggestion that you make. I can tell you that from my own travels around the country, kind of my anecdotal visits and chance to speak with congregations and communities across the country, as well as from the survey data that I've seen that, for example, Jay DeCath talked about yesterday morning, I just don't see it. I see a community that is robustly committed to social justice, whose commitment to this broad domestic social agenda and to concern internationally as well, not only hasn't diminished, has increased in significant ways and remains absolutely central to how American Jews see themselves as American Jews. So I don't know about left, right, and how much that matters. I do know that I find this commitment to social justice as a central part of Judaism to be undiminished as I travel around the country.
Mark?
Mark Levin, NCSJ. I just wanted to take a minute and thank Congresswoman Morella for all the years of support, but also for the letter that she mentioned that she's circulating with Congressman Lantos, and ask all of you to go back to your communities and urge your members of Congress to sign the Lantos-Morella letter on Jackson Vanik. The president wants to be able to go to Moscow with a bill in his pocket to say to President Putin that Russia has been graduated. This is our opportunity to ensure that religious freedom concerns, those concerns that directly affect the Jewish community in Russia, are addressed. And again, thank you, Congresswoman.
Thank you. Mark, you've been terrific on this whole issue all along, and I appreciate working with you. Since I have the mic just for a second, I would like to respond to these two dynamic speakers. First of all, Mark, you do know I voted against the energy bill because I feel very much about preserving ANWA. Secondly, right, and the CAFE standards. Secondly, I drive a hybrid car. So I already get 40 to 50 miles a gallon. And the American manufacturers have really got to start doing more of that. We have the technology. It's very simple. But we need to get the American people to say they'll also be willing to buy a hybrid car. We can save a tremendous amount of gasoline and reduce the pollution. Also, I voted against that, the charitable choice H.R. 7 Bill 2. So I just want to show you've got people on both sides of the aisle who are doing the right thing. Thank you.
I'm sorry for all those in line, but I think we have time for one more question because we got the next session coming up, and there's food at that one. So,
my name is David Leach from the CIC in Rhode Island. For the Congresswoman, since you're so knowledgeable on the Mideast, my question involves one of our so-called friends, Saudi Arabia. It seems to me that they are our friend, but they are ambivalent about our being there. They are seems to be a breeding ground for a particular kind of Muslim fundamentalism, which has spawned terrorists. I wonder if you might comment on our relationship with Saudi Arabia in that light.
Yeah, I think the president believes that he's going to have to make sure he keeps this alliance together, and Saudi Arabia indeed is part of that. But, you know, I have legislation in on access for Afghan women to make sure they are involved in this new government that's being formed, as well as helping the refugees who are 75% women and children. I put that in that context because we have finding in Saudi Arabia the fact that you have that entire sex that has been sublimated and oppressed. And I feel that the United States should speak up more strongly in terms of our people who are there in the service, men and women, to make sure that they don't have to conform to the, yeah, right.
The woman in that suit is a Rhode Islander.
Exactly. That frankly we are there and we can respect what we believe in, but we don't believe in that, and we should not require that our people conform to that. So I I think we have to be pretty cautious, but I think at this point we can perhaps help with bringing about some changes in Saudi Arabia. But the relationship, I think, is an important one now to the coalition.
Thank you.
I want to thank you. I want to thank our three speakers for being here today and for some excellent insights in what's going on in Congress today.
Thank you.
Your next session begins in about 10 minutes.
But, you know, he also
Thank you.
put in